And how's it going, everybody? It is Skullzi here with the latest gaming news, rumors, and speculation. Today we're leaving the speculation behind because I took the time and the skooma necessary in order to gather every official Bethesda statement out there that references spaceflight directly, or very strongly hints towards spaceflight being in the game. And when I say spaceflight, I don't mean a fast travel loading screen like the Outer Worlds, but instead I mean full-on player and NPC-controlled spaceflight, including ship combat, space piracy, space exploration, space Todd Howard, and more. And I'll be breaking down one of the biggest pieces of evidence supporting spaceflight yet, something that the majority of the community hasn't even seen before. We have a decent amount of information to break down today, so let's not waste any more time and get straight into today's content. First off, I wanted to focus more on the official Bethesda statements in this video rather than straight up speculation. While there is always a certain level of speculation in Bethesda videos like this, I still wanted to center in on the more concrete information, and because of this I won't be mentioning every Bethesda statement that could be associated with spaceflight in ways that require too deep of a journey into speculation town. Instead, the things I'll be covering today, in my opinion, are more likely related to spaceflight either directly in the statement itself or indirectly based upon the statement's literal wording. So let's start with something that I believe is one of the biggest pieces of evidence yet, something that many haven't seen before, a post from a previous Bethesda Game Studios design director, Bruce Nesmith. Bruce has been with Bethesda Game Studios for over 17 years, but seemed to have left Bethesda in September of 2021 to focus on being an author. However, in June of 2021, he posted this image and explained in the comments below that Bethesda sent him to a spacecraft flight simulator in order to do research for Starfield. While some may argue that Bruce was sent there to simply do visual research on how spaceship cockpits and instruments could look in-game, I'd argue against that. If they wanted to do visual research for the design of how spacecraft and their controls and instruments would look within Starfield, they could easily do that in Office. There's plenty of information and pictures online in order to do this, plenty of walkthrough videos on YouTube where they show you the inside of these literal spacecrafts. It would cost Bethesda a lot less to just do that kind of research in Office rather than pay the bill to fly their team out to a literal spaceflight simulator for spacecraft. Why would Bethesda be legit studying spaceflight simulation if spaceflight wasn't going to be in the game? I think this is a huge piece of evidence, because having someone sit in the cockpit of a literal spaceship and going through the spaceflight procedures and everything, that more aligns with spaceflight being in the game and being developed for the game rather than just overall visual design. The next piece of evidence is a post-E3 2019 interview featuring Elon Musk, Todd Howard, and Jeff Keighley, and Todd Howard mentions that Bethesda definitely did a lot of research on how physics would work in space, and in that same interview, Todd mentions that Bethesda took a realistic representation of space physics and gamified it for Starfield. And by gamified, he means that Starfield won't be like a space flight simulator like Kerbal Space Program. We won't have to be doing physics on gravitational influences of different planetary bodies just to traverse space or anything like that, but instead it would be something more accessible, like No Man's Sky, but probably a bit more realistic and in-depth. And me mentioning it's probably going to be like No Man's Sky, but more in-depth is just my own speculation, not part of Todd Howard's statement. But the point is, again, this is a huge piece of spaceflight evidence here in my opinion, as why would Bethesda put all this time and effort into researching space physics and then literally gamifying these physics to be more accessible to the overall player if they weren't going to be present in-game via manual spaceflight controlled by the player? It doesn't seem like the best use of research time and everything if it's not going to be a major mechanic in the game, is what I'm saying. Which brings us to our next piece of evidence, and perhaps the oldest piece of spaceflight evidence out there, a literal early gameplay video of spaceflight within a Bethesda Game Studios game from over 30 years ago. Let me say that again. People are claiming that a Bethesda Game Studios game that will release in 2022 won't have spaceflight. Meanwhile, here is a 30-plus-year-old video of a Bethesda Game Studios game having spaceflight. And of course, this game is The 10th Planet, Bethesda's first literal attempt at making a game like Starfield back in the late 80s and early 90s. Only the technology at the time to make this game actually be possible didn't exist, so they had to abandon the game and cancel it. But that technology exists now, because in multiple interviews since Starfield's original teaser trailer back at E3 2018, in ye old ancient times it feels like now, Todd has mentioned that Bethesda has been wanting to make a game like Starfield for a very long time. It's their dream game, essentially. This is evident based on the 10th Planet attempt that I mentioned earlier. However, he mentions numerous times times that the technology to make such a game exists now, and that is why Bethesda is making Starfield. One of the biggest, if not the biggest, gameplay mechanics of the 10th planet was literal spaceflight, flying around our solar system, which had realistic physics and gravity based on where you were located, by the way. You could even use the gravitational influence of different planets to aid in your space travels, and all the planets would have real-time orbits, and you could adjust your travels accordingly. This was their goal for a game set in the late 80s and early 90s. What are their main goals of the 10th planet, actually? So with all this in mind, why would Bethesda simply not include one of the main gameplay mechanics they clearly want to be in the game within Starfield in 2022, especially when they just massively upgraded their new game engine to accommodate for more gameplay mechanics? It just doesn't make sense, is what I'm saying. I mean, this is either one big oops or this is all leading towards manual spaceflight. But wait, there's more. Todd further mentions that the technology jump regarding Starfield is a larger jump than the jump from Morrowind to Oblivion, and this new engine is capable of a multitude of new gameplay features that we haven't seen from Bethesda yet. With this statement in mind, one of the known things Bethesda has struggled with over the years, according to their official statements, other than ladders, was vehicles. The creation engine just didn't handle player-controlled vehicles well, and their game worlds weren't really built to accommodate vehicle travel either. If the creation Engine 2 is indeed capable of multiple new gameplay features as stated before, it would make no sense for one of these features to not be spaceflight and player-controlled vehicles if this game engine was made essentially for a space game. And the next piece of evidence, while on the topic of Todd Howard, he literally states that Starfield says yes to many questions the player will have. Can I do that thing? Yes. What about that other thing? Yes. Can I fly a spaceship? No. That just wouldn't make sense. Todd seems very confident with this statement, and I feel if spaceflight wasn't in the game, he wouldn't have even made this particular just say yes statement to begin with. During interviews, even as far back as 2018, Todd states that Starfield will have what players expect and more, and given a BGS game set in space, especially their first next-gen RPG, I would say you'd expect spaceflight. So again, I don't feel like Todd Howard would say that Starfield has what you'd expect and more if it didn't have spaceflight. And the next thing, jumping back to that Todd Howard and Elon Musk 2019 interview, Todd mentions that spaceflight within Starfield is still dangerous and risky, sort of like flying in planes back in the 1940s, and that the fuel used for spaceflight within Starfield's universe is helium-3. Again, direct mentioning of spaceflight here, and when combined with everything else I listed so far, including how Bethesda gamified space physics, I highly doubt Bethesda would have put this much thought and world building and research into spaceflight if it was just a fast travel system. We most definitely will be piloting our ships, in my opinion. And last, the imagery. The entire E3 2021 Starfield trailer showed the player getting onto their ship, heading to the controls, and then getting ready to take off. We even saw the ship engines firing up and preparing liftoff procedures. The trailer showed us, as the player, front and center, getting into the controls of the ship and then taking off. This is a huge W for Team Spaceflight, in my opinion, that I think some people are kind of ignoring here. And last, the concept art. So much of the various official Starfield concept art features vehicles of all shapes and sizes, not only spacecraft, but also boats and planetary rovers. While these could just be simply decorative narrative elements that Bethesda places into the world, given everything else I broke down in this video, I'd say we very likely could not only fly our spaceships, but also other types of vehicles as well, which would just basically blow everyone's mind in my opinion, which again is a literal quote from Bethesda's Emil Pagliaro, as he states Starfield will make people lose their minds. There you have it. In my opinion, this is the most comprehensive list of evidence supporting player-controlled spaceflight within Starfield. While none of these statements straight up say players can manually fly their spaceship, I feel like Bethesda is saving those specific words and statements for their major gameplay reveal showcase this summer. However, when you place everything in this video together on a table before you, it quickly becomes immediately obvious as stuff falls off the table that the majority of information is in spaceflight's favor here. There's so much information the table can't contain it, and neither can my hype. Given the amount of time and research Bethesda spent on space physics and flight mechanics, to the huge upgrades the Creation Engine 2 has, to the literal statement from Todd Howard saying, Starfield says yes to can I do that thing, I'd have to say we're as close as we can possibly get to having spaceflight confirmed without it actually being confirmed officially. But as far as what my personal thoughts and opinions are to you all as a content creator, I gotta say hang on to that hype until we get direct information from Bethesda Bethesda themselves. That's the best way to avoid disappointment, but I still feel like everything I listed in this video would be one giant coincidence and some cyberpunk level over marketing if spaceflight wasn't in the game. After all, if Starfield can't say yes to spaceflight, and if Starfield is supposed to have what we'd expect and more, but doesn't have spaceflight, then I would say that's one of Todd Howard's biggest sweet little lies ever. But as always, what I want to know is, what do you think about all this? Does this convince you spaceflight will be in the game, or are you still on the fence? Let me know down in the comments below, and be sure to like the video as that helps the algorithm push the content to new people, and I would also greatly appreciate it. Also, be sure to subscribe and give the notification bell some skooma so you can stay in the know when it comes to the latest gaming news. And finally, if you want a permanent video shout out at the end of every single one of my future videos, consider supporting the channel over on Ko-fi, Patreon, or here on YouTube as an exclusive channel member. Links for all this and more are down in the description below, as well as a link for Skullzi merchandise and the Skullzi Discord server. And as always, thank you for watching. Be sure to tune in next time when simply skooma. That is all.
It just works.